Rome begins as a vulnerable city on a river, boxed in by rivals, measured by older powers, never sure it will survive the next generation. 5 centuries later, it is the central force of the Mediterranean, shaping borders, laws, trade, and the flow of wealth. Over the next week, I'm breaking down exactly how they built this unstoppable machine. I'm posting a new chapter every day leading up to a massive director's cut, so hit subscribe and like to follow the journey. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The history of the greatest military power of antiquity begins with geography, desperation, and blood. To understand how Rome arose, we must travel to the 8th century BC to the western coast of central Italy, along the banks of the Tiber River. At that time, Italy was a patchwork of fierce tribes and advanced civilizations. To the north lay the Etruscan League, master metallurgists and city builders. To the south, wealthy Greek colonies controlled the trade routes. Squeezed between them, a group of Latin and Sabine outcasts settled on a series of 7 hills. Legend whispers of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers nursed by a she-wolf. But the historical reality was far more pragmatic. They built their thatched huts on the Palatine Hill for one simple reason: survival. The hills provided a natural fortress against raiders, and more importantly, elevated them above the deadly, malaria-infested swamps that choked the valley floor. These early Romans were a rough, frontier people. They survived by controlling the vital salt routes that ran from the coast into the Apennine Mountains. But they were not yet an empire. For the first 2.5 centuries of their existence, the Romans were ruled by kings, the most powerful of whom were Etruscan conquerors from the north. It was under the heavy hand of the Etruscan Kings that Rome transformed from a village into a true city. The Etruscans brought advanced engineering. They taught the Romans how to build with stone, how to fight in a disciplined phalanx, and how to conquer nature itself. Their greatest achievement was the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain. Using massive stone arches, the engineers channeled the stagnant waters of the central swamp directly into the Tiber River. By draining the valley, they created a solid, dry expanse of land between the hills. This reclaimed land became the Roman Forum, the beating political and commercial heart of the city, where the fate of millions would eventually be decided. But the Romans were a fiercely proud people, and tyranny does not breed loyalty. By 509 BC, the city was ruled by Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He was a brutal autocrat who treated the Roman elite not as advisors, but as subjects. The breaking point came when the king's son committed an unforgivable crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia. Her subsequent suicide sparked an explosion of aristocratic rage. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, the Roman patricians rose up, overthrew the monarchy, and drove Tarquin into exile. From that day forward, the Romans harbored a deep generational hatred for the very concept of a king. To ensure that no single man could ever again hold absolute power, they created a radically new system of government. They called it the res publica, the public thing. Instead of a monarch, power was divided. 2 consuls were elected every year to lead the armies, each holding veto power over the other. They were advised by the Senate, a council of the wealthiest and most experienced patricians. It was an oligarchy built on extreme discipline, a strict social hierarchy, and an absolute expectation that the ruling class would bleed on the battlefield alongside the commoners. The young republic was forged in the fires of near total annihilation. In 390 BC, a terrifying new enemy breached the Alps and descended into the Italian peninsula, the Gauls. Led by a warlord named Brennus, a horde of Celtic warriors shattered the Roman army at the Battle of the Allia. The defeat was so sudden and so absolute that the gates of Rome were left wide open. The Gauls poured into the city, burning the temples and slaughtering the elders who had refused to flee. The surviving Roman patricians and soldiers retreated to the steep cliffs of the Capitoline Hill, enduring a starving, desperate siege for months. Finally, forced to the negotiating table, the Romans agreed to pay a humiliating ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold to convince the Gauls to leave. As the gold was being weighed, the Romans complained that the Gallic weights were rigged. In response, Brennus unbuckled his heavy iron sword and threw it onto the scales, tipping them further against Rome. He uttered two words that would scar the Roman psyche for 1,000 years. Vae victis. Woe to the vanquished. Rome survived, but the trauma of the sack fundamentally rewired their society. They realized that diplomatic treaties and natural borders were illusions. The only guarantee of survival was absolute military supremacy. They surrounded their rebuilt city with a massive ring of stone, known as the Servian Wall, and they turned their eyes outward, determined to never be the vanquished again. By the middle of the 4th century BC, Rome had systematically conquered or assimilated the surrounding Latin tribes. Their hunger for arable land and security pushed their borders south, into the fertile plains of Campania. But there they collided with a power equal to their own, the Samnites. The Samnites were fierce, battle-hardened Highland warriors who controlled the rugged Apennine spine of Italy. Unlike the urbanized Etruscans or the coastal Greeks, the Samnites lived in fortified mountain villages. For over half a century, across 3 brutal wars, Rome and Samnium bled each other for dominance of the peninsula. The conflict reached its darkest hour for Rome in 321 BC at the Caudine Forks. Through a brilliant campaign of deception, the Samnite commander Gaius Pontius lured 2 invading Roman consular armies deep into a narrow, claustrophobic mountain pass. When the Romans reached the end of the gorge, they found it barricaded with felled trees and boulders. Turning back, they saw the entrance sealed behind them. Trapped, out of water, and surrounded by Samnite archers on the high ground, the Roman legions were forced to surrender without striking a single blow. Gaius Pontius did not slaughter them. Instead, he chose a humiliation far worse than death. He disarmed tens of thousands of Roman soldiers, stripped them to their tunics, and forced them to bow down and crawl under a yoke made of Samnite spears. It was the ultimate psychological degradation in the ancient world. Most nations would have sued for permanent peace. Rome returned to the drawing board. The Senate analyzed the disaster at the Caudine Forks and realized a terrifying truth. Their army was obsolete. Up to this point, Rome fought using the Greek-style phalanx, a dense, rigid wall of spearmen. The phalanx was devastating on a flat plain, But in the broken, uneven ravines of Samnium, it fractured and fell apart. Rome needed an army that could bend without breaking. In an unprecedented display of military pragmatism, they abandoned the spear wall entirely and invented the Manipular Legion. The new army was arranged in a checkerboard pattern of small, independent units called maniples. If the front line encountered difficult terrain or heavy resistance, the gaps allowed fresh units from the second line to seamlessly step forward and replace exhausted fighters. They also changed their weapons. The long thrusting spears were replaced by the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to pierce and weigh down an enemy's shield, and the gladius, a brutally efficient short sword built for close quarters stabbing. The Roman legionary was no longer a cog in a static wall. He was a highly mobile, heavily armored shock trooper. But a revolutionary army is useless if it cannot be supplied. The Samnite Wars were fought deep in hostile mountains, hundreds of miles from the Roman Forum. To project their new military power, the Republic turned to its engineers. In 312 BC, a fiercely determined Roman censor named Appius Claudius Caecus commissioned a project that would change the face of the earth. It was the Via Appia. This was not a dirt track for merchants. It was an industrial artery of war. Roman surveyors drove the road straight as an arrow through the treacherous Pontine marshes, laying deep foundations of crushed gravel topped with massive, tightly fitted basalt slabs. The Via Appia ignored the natural contours of the land, cutting through hills and bridging ravines. It allowed the Republic to march legions, siege equipment, and endless supply wagons south at a terrifying speed, regardless of the weather. Armed with the flexible Manipular Legion and connected by an indestructible logistical lifeline, Rome ground the Samnites into dust. By 290 BC, the mountain lords were broken. Rome now stood as the undisputed master of central Italy. But as their legions marched to the very southern shores of the peninsula, they looked out across the Mediterranean waters and realized their greatest test was yet to come. Master of Italy, but a novice on the world stage. The Samnite Wars are over, but the Punic Wars are about to change everything. Tomorrow, the Republic undergoes its most radical transformation yet. Subscribe now so you're there when the first Roman fleet sets sail. Woe to the vanquished.